Welcome to a survey of fingerprint examiners' attitudes toward probabilistic reporting presented by Simon Cole. This is part of the Fall 2021 webinar series sponsored by NIST. Our speaker today is Dr. Simon Cole from the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Cole is a professor of criminology, law, and society, and we're happy to have him with us today. Simon, I'm going to let you take.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to present this project on a survey of fingerprint examiners' attitudes towards probabilistic reporting. This project was done in collaboration with Valerie King, who is a student at the University of California, Irvine, and with Henry Swafford, who is currently a student at the University of Lausanne, but was at the U.S. Army Crime Laboratory at the time that this project began. So I want to acknowledge the cooperation of the U.S. Army Crime Laboratory in this project. Okay. So this project had three goals. Here at CSAFE, we're very interested in applying probability to forensic science, and specifically one of the areas where we want to apply it is in the reporting of forensic results. And so the first goal was to understand where we are now. To what extent is forensic evidence actually reported probabilistically? And we do this by focusing on a single, very common, canonical, iconic discipline, friction ridge or fingerprint examination. The second was to understand, again, in one particular major iconic discipline, the attitudes of practitioners towards the very topic of probabilistic reporting. And the third was to capture and record the experiences of the few latent print examiners who have adopted probabilistic reporting. And I list that third goal as not having been achieved by this project, because as you'll see, we had so few respondents who used probabilistic reporting that we really didn't have meaningful results and weren't really able to achieve that goal. So I'm not going to say really more about that in this presentation. So this survey was a web-based anonymous survey. We made efforts to disseminate it through professional organizations such as the International Association for Identification, the standards writing and setting bodies, the CLPEX chat board, and other email forums. We were asking for professional fingerprint examiners to complete the survey. We had 435 open surveys and about 247 generally completed responses. Not all respondents completed all sections, so the ends that you see in the presentation may differ from question to question. We thought this was an overwhelmingly large response, that latent print practitioners are very happy and eager to express their opinions about scientific and technical issues in their area, especially compared to a survey I had done previously of crime lab directors that got a much lower response. And in fact, our IRB forms, we said we expected 100 responses, and we had to amend that. So we thought it was very, very good response. As I go through this presentation, I will use the terms probabilistic and categorical, and here are sort of simple definitions that we used in this study. Just very basically, a probabilistic statement is one that assigns a probability to both a hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis, and a categorical statement is, you might also call it a statement of certainty. It's one that doesn't assign a probability to the alternate hypothesis, or comes very close to doing that by sort of dismissing the alternate hypothesis. So we had a couple of ways of trying to get at how latent print examiners report. And I will discuss two of them right now. One was we simply gave them these three choices, categoric, probabilistic, and what we call categoric 2, and said which looks most like what you report in written reports. And so the first one was we gave a number of options, but it was a sort of generally categoric statement. The second one was a generally probabilistic statement. And the third one was a statement about kind of the strength, the amount of demonstrable support for the conclusion that some examiners argue is the way to testify. And so we, report. And we called this categoric 2 because we think it's basically a categoric statement. So in response to this question, you see overwhelmingly, most people chose the categoric response, but 31 people chose the probabilistic response. Very few chose this third response. Then the next thing that we did was said, well, tell us in your own words how you report. So then instead of giving them fixed responses, we asked the respondents to use their own words to describe what a report was, what a report should look like. And then tell us whether this is probabilistic or categorical. There's another way of measuring more or less the same thing. And we get similar results. About 88% of the respondents say, here's my report, and I report categorically. Only 12% of the respondents say, here's my report, and it's a probabilistic report. But then a funny thing happens as we read these responses. We see that of the 30 who say they report probabilistically, if we actually read the response, it's a categoric response in 26 out of the 30 times. And if you don't believe us, here's an example of one that we said that the respondent said it was a probabilistic statement, but we think it's a categoric statement. The respondent is saying they conclude that two impressions originated from the same source. It's a categoric statement of certainty. In fact, the converse happened as well. Two respondents who said that they reported categorically reported probabilistically. So here's an example of that. This respondent self-reported that they were a categoric reporter, but in fact they're talking about likelihoods in a probabilistic fashion. So if you believe us researchers, two things can be concluded from this. If you believe us researchers rather than the respondent's self-reports, the skew towards categoric reporting is even greater than we thought. It's actually 98% of respondents are reporting categorically, and only 2% are reporting probabilistically. So the dominance of categoric reporting seems even greater than we might have thought. The second thing, of course, is the misunderstanding of the terms that this seems to indicate. With the number of people saying, I report probabilistically, but in fact, it appears to be a categoric report. We then moved on to asking, this is sort of very general question, do you think probabilistic reporting is a good thing for the field, is an appropriate direction for the fingerprint community? Answer according to a Likert scale. And if you look at these responses, and over here in this column, we aggregate the two agree responses and the two disagree responses, we see that it breaks down basically as 2/3 of respondents think it's inappropriate, about 1/3 think it's appropriate, and a relatively small number are neutral on the question. So this is, I think, an interesting result. What you think of it kind of depends on what you expected. I can see an argument that 2/3 of practitioners thinking probabilistic reporting is inappropriate is kind of depressing news for for us in CSAFE who are advocating for this. On the other hand, I can also see that 1/3 finding it appropriate in 2018, 2019 is actually higher than one would have expected, and certainly higher than it would have been 10 years ago or 20 years ago. In fact, is surprisingly high and encouraging. So you could look at that either way, but that's what it is. If practitioners are skeptical of probabilistic reporting, why is that? And we gave them a number of possible reasons why we thought somebody might be against probabilistic reporting. And here's more or less how they break down. And the main observation that I would make about this list is that first of all, the kind of rule-oriented sanction, like I would be decertified by the International Association for Identification, is very low. Seems very little to be the concern. Concerns about the consumption of the report by other actors in the criminal justice system are very high. Defense attorneys, judges and jurors, law enforcement are all at the top of the list. So the top concerns seem to be about the consumption of the report by the non-technical actors, the legal actors in the criminal justice system. And then we asked them in their own words, in qualitative responses, to explain why they thought probabilistic reporting was either appropriate or inappropriate. And we got very rich qualitative responses, which we coded here. So these on the left are our codes, trying to find common themes among those reports. But again, very rich and interesting set of responses, and very, very, very heterogeneous as well. They were not cookie cutter of one another. There was a variety of different ideas and perspectives expressed. So among people who thought that probabilistic reporting was appropriate, the main reasons were it was more accurate, whatever accurate is supposed to mean, more scientific in some sense. Many mentioned that it expressed uncertainty and that was a good thing. And then we'll see in a minute that people on the other side thought uncertainty was a bad thing. Jury clarity also is a factor on both sides of the debate. These appropriate respondents thought that probabilistic reporting was in fact enhanced clarity for the jury, whereas the people who think it's inappropriate thought the opposite. And other reasons were transparency. The weight of the evidence was discussed, so that's of interest to statisticians. It was finer, less coarse. Uniqueness is unproven, and therefore we need to report probabilistically. And the word objectivity was used among many of them. Among the larger group, the 2/3 who thought that probabilistic reporting is inappropriate, what were the most common reasons? And the bold text on the following slides are basically statistical terms. For the benefit of this being a CSAFE presentation, I've kind of highlighted references to technical statistical terms. So the most common by far was, again, as I mentioned on the last slide, that jury confusion. Probabilistic reporting will confuse the jury. The second most common was, I'm not against probabilistic reporting in principle, but it's not ready. It's not ready for prime time. Underselling of the evidence, that probabilistic reporting necessarily understates the probative value of the evidence, was next. Quantification is impossible, which I'll talk about in a minute. uncertainty can be eliminated. It's misleading. There were some references to uniqueness. Opinionization is the argument that, well, a report is just an opinion, so it's not necessary to make it probabilistic. In the next few slides, I'll drill down into some of those most common responses. And whoops. Jury confusion, number one response. Response on top, until probabilistic language is valid and reliable, as well as easily understood by all practitioners and easily explained, they are useless numbers. They confuse the trier of fact, add little to the data, and very likely will serve to bolster the testimony and the evidence. And that word bolster is kind of interesting because, again, it's an argument used by both sides. Again, advocates of probabilistic reporting, of course, think that categorical reporting is bolstering the evidence because you're reporting something that's uncertain as if it were certain. But skeptics of probabilistic reporting feel that probabilistic reporting unfairly bolsters the evidence. I think by lending a kind of patina of science and quantification to the evidence, they think it's sort of improper bolstering of the evidence. A second sample response from this group, probabilistic language without a statistical backing is problematic. It's confusing. Your opinion is really that they are from the same source. Adding phrases like likelihood of occurring is practically impossible, is confusing without statistical backing. And then this respondent says, once that exists, so I think saying once there is a statistical model, please, like I would like there to be a statistical model, then we won't have to have this argument anymore. Probability not ready, again, a very common argument. I'm not against probability in principle, but now is not the time, it's not ready. And many of these responses sort of directly called out the US Army crime laboratory statistical software, FRStat, which is well known in the field. So a probability model doesn't exist other than the US Army one. And then some not nice things said about the US Army one, that it's pulled from thin air and easily manipulated. Second response, I concede that exclusion of all others is difficult to support. However, reporting probabilities and using models opens the door for error as well. I haven't seen any models or research that can adequately account for the weight given to specific points in specific areas. Nothing can give weight to features in combination. Certain arrangements, and then gives an example. And this was a very common response that that the respondents correctly, I think, understood that statistical models were all kind of simplifications of the information available in friction ridges, and they found that problematic. Third response, there's no current scientific basis for a probabilistic model. Reporting probabilistic conclusions, latent print conclusions in probabilistic language is misleading and unscientific. Statistics are not in themselves scientific or objective. Underselling, again, as I mentioned, the notion that that a probabilistic report is not doing full justice to the probative value of the evidence. So a lot of references like this to weakness. It's not strong enough, it's too weak, it's meaningless, lacks the strength of ID. And this long response, I disagree because it's impossible to apply a probability to something that's unique. Scientific basis in biology is well established, therefore probabilistic language is inappropriate and unscientific. It's misleading to a jury and a judge, giving them a false impression of the value of the evidence. Another interesting response, again, interesting, I think, especially to CSAFE researchers, is the argument that the quantification of friction ridge evidence simply can't be done. So unlike 2 slides previous, or I'm for probabilistic reporting, but the models just aren't ready yet. There are some who argue it won't ever be ready. It's not possible. So I don't feel there will ever be a probabilistic model that can accurately determine the frequency of a grouping of minutiae, for the same reason we cannot say we're 100% certain of the source. So again, as in the previous slide, it's sort of a reference to the richness of the information and the fact that a model is over a simplification, but they're arguing that it won't ever be solved. Second response, I believe there cannot be probabilistic language involved with latent print examination. There are too many variables. It's too subjective to have probability. Another one, it's impossible to apply a probability to something that is unique. Pretty blanket statement. And again, many references to DNA. Probabilistic reporting is seen as something that comes to the friction ridge discipline from DNA in many responses. Unlike DNA, which has a finite number of possibilities at given alleles, fingerprint identification cannot be stated with probabilistic language with accuracy. A similarly kind of pessimistic response, I guess I'd call this an optimistic response, we don't need probability because the statisticians are wrong. We can eliminate uncertainty. So this is, of course, an argument that has a long history in the friction ridge discipline, and it's still around. So when I form the opinion that I've made an identification, I'm certain that it's this person. There's no probability. If I'm not certain, then I won't make an identification. Second response, the chance that two prints are originating from different sources is paramount to 0. And third response, again, just very clear response. Ident is ident. I don't see the purpose of assigning a probability number. It's 100%, or I wouldn't call it ident. Another argument, again, I think of interest to statisticians is this is kind of a variation on the old saying that all models are wrong, but some are informative. But this is emphasizing the first part, that all models are wrong, and so these models don't capture all the information. So it's an applied science, a high number of variables. There will be probability models that will accurately. I don't think there will ever be a probability model that will reflect the full complexity and weight of these comparisons. Therefore, it's misleading to report this way. It's incomplete at best or incorrect at worst. Second response, probabilistic language only accounts for the minutiae, and it totally disregards features that are unique in themselves, such as creases, vestiges, pore sizes, etc., which I think is generally true, that probabilistic models, as they are proposed now, are simplifications in that sense. Again, I think of particular interest to CSAFE is some expressions that were skeptical of statistics as a whole, as a discipline, that this whole idea is kind of an invasion of the discipline by the discipline of statistics. So we have a long analogy here, contrasting kind of direct inspection of individual cases with data derived from samples of cases. But the bottom line is, I think examiners should use great care in making statements and conclusions, describe statistics as a bandwagon and a fad rather than substantive. And the second response, again, says it's being imposed upon us because it's supposed to be more scientific. Again, it's coming from the DNA discipline. And again, the reference to statistics as statistical humdrum. and there's nothing wrong with what we're doing now. So in the next phase of the survey, we asked respondents to describe in their own words, again, qualitative responses, what is probabilistic reporting. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, it's sort of clear that that this question was, I think, interpreted, probably wasn't as narrowly focused as it could have been, and was generally interpreted in two ways. Some respondents responded in kind of a technical way. They sort of gave a technical definition of probabilistic reporting. Others kind of responded socially, as it were. They sort of described the social phenomenon of probabilistic reporting in forensic science or in the friction ridge discipline. So kind of what is it? It's a thing that lawyers are trying to make us do, and responses like that. And I think both responses are legitimate responses to both types of responses are legitimate responses to the way we wrote the prompt, but we got both of those responses. So probabilistic reporters, again, is a small, that's how we've divided the two groups. That's a very small group here, very low ends. Again, I've bolded the kind of statistical terms in the responses. We get to a larger group here with 177 categoric reporters. And what is probabilistic reporting to them? Uncertainty was the most common response. Quantification was second, something that confuses the jury. We've already talked about that. Probability not ready. We've already talked about that. And then a number of kind of technical statistical terms. So again, statisticians may be interested that some technical statistical terms were given back to us here in the respondents' own words. General statements about random match probabilities, about the weight of evidence, about the likelihood ratio, which was kind of evenly divided between the likelihood ratio correctly stated and the likelihood ratio with the conditional inverted, which is not that surprising because everybody inverts the conditional. So I won't go into too much detail on these, but here are some samples of some of these responses where the responses are saying accurately, I think, what is probabilistic reporting? It's trying to attach uncertainty to the conclusion. This second statement, nothing in science is absolute and should never be explained to others as absolute. Therefore, probabilistic reporting. Third response, it's essentially the calculation of a scientific measurement of uncertainty for latent print conclusions. I think these are very kind of reassuring statements in response to this question of what probabilistic reporting is. Quantification is not really surprising. It's about numbers rather than words. Random match probability, a number of respondents kind of described the notion of a random match probability, and that was what was meant by probabilistic reporting. So I won't go through these in detail, but again, this is a kind of match probability approach. It's a statistical model to convey the likelihood of finding someone else with the same characteristics in those prints. Others responded with sort of general, sort of not quite random match probability, but more towards a weight of the evidence approach. So here's an example of one pertaining to an identification result. Probabilistic reporting is a more unbiased way of disclosing the strength or weakness of a proposed association. For second response, probabilistic reporting would involve some sort of calculation to give a weight to the conclusion based on the information present in the known and unknown. And third, probabilistic reporting can provide a measure of the weight of evidence. So again, just to remind us, these are friction-ridge practitioners in their own words, without prompts, not statisticians, kind of articulating a weight of evidence approach in explaining to us on the survey what probabilistic reporting is. So kind of reassuring results in that sense. So there's lots more in the responses. Again, I just want to emphasize they're extremely rich, and I have to say, I'm reading them, extremely varied. Again, just lots of different ideas floating around, which made it a challenge to code the responses to kind of sort things into common bins, because there was so much heterogeneity in the things that people said. But what can we conclude from this? The first thing clearly is that, at least as reflected in our survey, which is certainly not a representative group and is probably a self-selected group, we thought it was we were pleased with the size of the group. That based on this, probabilistic reporting remains rare in terms of actually making it into courtroom testimony or written reports. Possibly, really 2% of our respondents. So all indications suggest probabilistic reporting is very rarely used in actual practice. Generally speaking, it remains fairly poorly understood, although perhaps getting better, as indicated by people misclassifying their own statements and by the responses to describing it. Generally speaking, about 2/3 of respondents are, 2 years ago, were unconvinced of the need for probabilistic reporting. And again, as I said earlier, that could be looked at as a kind of discouragingly large number, or it could be encouraging that 1/3 of respondents were in favor of probabilistic reporting and thought it was an appropriate direction for the field. As I just said a minute ago, the latent print practitioners are heterogeneous in their perspectives on reporting. So, one consequence of that is that I don't think that there's a single myth or two myths that need to be overcome to persuade friction-ridge examiners that probabilistic reporting is appropriate. So it's not like one just needs to persuade people that uniqueness of friction-ridge skin is not enough, or zero error rate is wrong. It's not simply these things. There are many kind of well-argued reasons for skepticism about probabilistic reporting that were articulated in these responses that do not reduce down simply to things like uniqueness or zero error rate. Those things were in there, more uniqueness than zero error rate, but they were uncommon. I've already anticipated my next bullet point. These sort of common myths, like uniqueness is all you need to know, zero error rate, they were there in the survey, but they were not common. They were not common responses. So they're not gone, but they're certainly not as common as they were 10 or 20 years ago. The final thing we would point out is the kind of noticeable degree to which concerns about probabilistic reporting are about what we would call externalities. And by externalities, I mean kind of things that are not internal to the science and technology of friction ridge examination. There was some of that, of course, the concerns about the adequacy of the models and the fact that they were simplifications and so on. But those were not as common as concerns about what we call externalities, which is primarily the consumption of the evidence by judges, jurors, lawyers, police, and so on. Much more common was concern about misunderstanding or dissatisfaction with the evidence if it was reported in this way. And I think that that's an interesting thing to think about. I've called these externalities here, so I think that probably gives a sense of what I think about that. And I think it could be argued in a number of different ways, but there is a sense in which such concerns are external to the science and technology of the discipline itself. It is in some sense not necessarily the problem of the discipline of friction ridge analysis if non-scientific legal actors misunderstand the evidence. Now, it certainly is a problem for the legal system, but it's not necessarily a problem for a scientist trying to report accurately and faithfully the results of their scientific analysis. So I just want to draw attention to the extent to which concerns about this consumption problem have kind of worked their way into the discipline in terms of shaping people's attitudes about how they want to report the results of their scientific analysis. So with that, I hope I've left enough time for questions, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Simon. I appreciate it. And I think you've left a perfect amount of time for questions. I'd like to start off just by addressing the question of education. So there was a kind of a sense that folks felt maybe they weren't properly trained in understanding probabilities. What do you think the next steps are for that?
So for people to be properly trained in understanding probabilities?
Correct.
Anthony? Yeah, I mean, I think that a balance needs to be struck between at where we expect practitioners to be educated in kind of the continuum between being a statistician yourself and being somebody who pushes a button and doesn't understand what's going on behind the button, right? So clearly we want the level of education to be somewhere between those points. And I think in some sense that gets us to the third part of the survey, in which we did survey probabilistic reporters about whether they found education helpful, and they did, but the numbers are so small that I couldn't really persuade you that to necessarily trust those results. So I think we need more. I think we need more experience with people getting education in probabilistic reporting and surveying them and asking whether it helps before we can really answer that question.
Thank you. Are you able to see the Q&A, or would you like me to read them out to you?
I do see it.
Okay.
So Alicia, do we know how many latent print examiners there are in the United States? I don't know the answer offhand. I can't remember if we made an estimate in the paper. I know there's somewhere close to 1,000 certified IAI certified practitioners. I don't know the membership of the IAI. Someone on here probably does. It's got to be a lot large. So it's got to be a lot larger than 1,000. So I don't have that answer to hand. Sorry about that. Next question, were you able to differentiate between the responses of certified latent examiners and those that are not? Also, what about accredited versus unaccredited laboratories? Because I assume accreditation falls under a standard of reporting. So we have the demographic, I believe we have the demographic data on how many were certified, but we don't have those connected to the responses. So I don't think we attempted to differentiate the responses by certification. And I don't think we had the data on accredited. So I think some of what you're asking could be done, but we did not do. So it's interesting idea to look into to see if we find anything, an effect of being certified. I'm not sure being accredited would shape how you report, because I wouldn't think the accreditation states that you either have to or can't report probabilistically. John Welsh, is probabilistic reporting is simply changing ident to extremely strong support for ident? Then it may just be a change of terminology. Do any latent print examiners report at a lower level of connection, such as strong report for ident? The answer to that is yes. So there are some practitioners and even laboratories that no longer use the term identification and instead would use a term like extremely strong support for the hypothesis. In addition to that, the new OSAC document, which I'm a member of the Friction Ridge subcommittee, now sort of allows for a conclusion of strong support for same source. It also allows for identification. So it has both of those conclusions available. So both those things can happen. You can keep identification and have strong support as a kind of lower report, or there are some people who their strongest support is still their strongest statement is still a statement of extremely strong support. James, Maddie, have these questions been posed? Have you ever made a mistake? Do you know of any examiner who has ever made a mistake? No, we did not pose these questions in this survey. I'm not sure whether our CSAFE colleagues at University of Virginia in their surveys posed anything like that either. Tyler Belknap, did you identify whether multiple responses were sent from the same laboratory? For example, there might be 6 responses in favor of probabilistic reporting, but they're all employed by the same laboratory. So no, we did not do that. The survey was anonymous. And so you're right. It certainly is plausible to think that there are multiple responses from the same laboratory. It's certainly plausible for me to think that maybe the survey got passed around in a laboratory, so you would get higher responses from some laboratories than others. I also think there were some similarities in language that would suggest that people know each other. Jeff Salyards, I missed a few moments. Did you collect information about the participants, education level, experience, math fluency, et cetera? If so, did you notice any trends? Yes, so we have demographic information. I didn't do it in the presentation. The underlying paper, which is published in Law, Probability, and Risk, does contain more information about the demographics. But what we did not do, as I said in response to your previous question, is try to find correlations between the demographics and the responses. An anonymous question, have you considered a follow-up survey as the OSAC standard for friction ridge examination conclusions has come out and becomes more widely adopted? No, I don't think we had considered that. Thank you for the suggestion. Yes, LCD, you did mention in your paper the age ranges of the correspondents. Are there correlations between older LPs and their stance about probability versus the younger LPs, which seems to be a culture change? So yeah, that's a very good question, and we have the data. We would have to look at that to see if we find any meaningful correlations. Henry will be better able to answer that, but whether it was that we didn't find anything interesting or that we haven't looked closely enough yet. David Johnson, how would you address, Anthony, should I keep reading the names of the questioners? Is that helpful?
Yeah, that'd be great actually for our YouTube viewers.
Okay. How would you address concerns about externalities when it comes to hair evidence, bite marks, bullet lead analysis? Doesn't the forensic scientist have responsibility to make sure our testimony and results are understood? You know, I don't know. I mean, I certainly think it could be argued both ways, but I think that there's an argument that that the system as a whole has a responsibility to make sure the testimony is understood, but not necessarily the discipline, and maybe not necessarily the individual examiner. I mean, you could argue. And again, I'm not going to argue that I have to be right about this, but you could argue that the primary responsibility of the individual scientist is to report as accurately and transparently and faithfully as to the evidence as possible, and that overrides all, even concerns about comprehension by other people. And you can draw analogies with other areas of science. You could argue that an astrophysicist's responsibility is to report, what they think the universe is like as accurately as possible, and not worry about that much about whether people understand it. So you don't have to, that's my viewpoint, but I'm not going to claim it's the only possible viewpoint. James, Maddie, in my opinion, the scientific community needs to develop methods for communicating with the lay public within the topic at hand and in the larger world. We are facing problems related to the pandemic because the scientific community has not been able to adequately communicate. Of course, absolutely, I agree. I'm, in my remarks about externalities, I'm not trying to diminish the importance of science communication. I think science communication is an enormously important topic in all areas of science, and forensic science is not accepted from that. But there is a sense in which I would argue the scientist has to have the science right before they try to tackle the communication problem. And I would argue when you're doing things like rounding uncertainty into certain off in up to certainty, that's not getting the science right. Jason Eversole, for the 2% of people who are using probabilistic reporting, what are they basing the probability on? Do they have a statistical model to support that? Great question. I suspect that they are using FRStat, or they are using verbal, subjective, intuitive probabilities. So they're making likelihood ratios like strong support or extremely strong support based not on a statistical model, but based on their own personal subjective probabilities. And I'm, as many of you probably know, there's a big debate over the use of subjective probabilities, but I think that's what's happening. An anonymous question: do you see the current 5-step OSAC scale in review as more probabilistic or categorical? Seems like this would be the driving factor for our general direction. I see the that's a great question. The 5-step OSAC scale is both probabilistic and categorical. It's probabilistic in that for the first time, or almost the first time, it allows friction ridge examiners to give probabilistic conclusions, such as strong support for same source or strong support for different source. Those are, in some sense, probabilistic conclusions. On the other hand, it's obviously categorical, right? It has 5 categories. That's categorical. So in some sense, it's both. It's not categorical in the sense we used in this survey, because in this survey, categorical was really referring to the old 3-point categorical scale of exclusion, inconclusive, and identification, which is different in a sense, because the two categories on the end are statements of certainty. As my last word, if I could just read the response from my co-author, Henry.
Oh, by all means, go ahead.
Henry says, for your information, all original data are publicly available on the CSAFE website, which is true. The demographic data are tied to the responses to permit anyone to review or analyze as they choose. So thanks, Henry.
Simon, thank you very much for sharing all of this with us today and for your lively discussion at the end here. Thank you all for attending, and we hope you have a great day.